She turned around, looked at me once, and I knew I wasn't escaping tonight. The maintenance bay of Outpost 7 was supposed to be empty that night, and Jake Morgan had counted on it because the less attention he drew to himself, the better, and humans like him were barely tolerated this far into alien-controlled space, and he was just trying to fix the cooling system and get back to his quarters before anyone noticed. The sound of boots on metal made him freeze, and he knew those footsteps, and they belonged to one of the Velrani commanders, and the Velrani were the worst, and they were tall and powerful, and they looked at humans like insects. And this one was the worst of them all. Her name was Kira, and she stood nearly 7 feet tall, with silver skin that seemed to glow in the dim light, and her eyes were like molten gold and sharp enough to cut through steel. And she wore the black armor of her rank, and every movement she made was like a predator circling. Prey Jake slowly stood up from behind the console and tried to look casual, even though his heart was hammering in his chest and he could feel sweat on his palms. She had not seen him yet, and she was examining something on a data pad, and her face was unreadable and cold, and beautiful in a way that made him forget to breathe. Then she looked up. Their eyes met across the bay, and for one terrible moment time seemed to stop, and he saw her expression shift from surprise to something else, and something calculating and dangerous. Jake did the only thing he could think of, and he ran. The corridor outside was a maze of metal and shadows, and he knew every corner of this station because he had spent 2 years crawling through maintenance shafts and fixing broken systems, and if anyone could disappear here, it was him. Behind him, he heard her boots hitting the floor in steady rhythm, and she was not running, and she did not need to because she knew he could not escape, and the station was locked down for the night cycle, and there was nowhere to go. His mind raced as he ducked into a side passage, and he needed a plan, and he needed it fast because Velrani warriors did not give up, and they especially did not give up when their pride was challenged. He slipped into a maintenance shaft and pulled the grate closed behind him and held his breath, and through the metal slats he could see her shadow approaching, and she moved like liquid darkness and utterly silent now. She stopped right in front of his hiding spot. For a long moment she stood there and perfectly still, and then she spoke, and her voice was like honey over broken glass, and it made his skin prickle. "I can smell you, human." And she said it softly and almost amused. Jake pressed himself against the far wall of the shaft, and his muscles tense and ready to bolt. "You are clever," and she continued, "and I watched you work for weeks, and you think no one notices you. But I notice everything." That caught him off guard, and weeks, and she had been watching him come out, and she commanded, and her tone shifted to something harder. "And I will make this quick." Quick meant dead, and Jake had no intention of dying tonight in a maintenance shaft, and not when he had survived 3 colony wars and a plague outbreak and more close calls than he could count. Instead, he did something stupid. He kicked open the far end of the shaft and dropped into the lower service level, and his feet hit the ground running, and he could hear her curse behind him in her own language, and it sounded like music and thunder combined. The lower levels were darker and colder and filled with the hum of machinery, and he wove between massive coolant tanks and power converters, and he was smaller and faster in tight spaces, and that was his advantage, but she was relentless. Every time he thought he had lost her, she appeared again, and blocking a corridor or dropping from an overhead passage, and her golden eyes locked onto him with unwavering focus. He began to realize something strange, and she was not trying to catch him, and not really. And she was testing him and pushing him to see what he would do and how he would survive. It made him angry. He ducked into a control room and sealed the door behind him, and his fingers flew over the console, and he rerouted power to the corridor outside, and the lights went dark and emergency bulkheads began to close, and it would trap her for maybe 5 minutes if he was lucky. He leaned against the console and breathing hard and trying to think. The door exploded inward. She stood in the doorway and backlit by emergency lighting, and her armor was scorched where she had forced her way through, and her face was not angry. She was smiling, impressive, and she said, and stepping into the room, and most humans would have begged by now. Jake straightened and met her gaze, and he was terrified, but he would die before he showed it. "What do you want?" And he asked, and keeping his voice steady. She tilted her head and studying him like he was a puzzle she could not quite solve. "I want to understand," and she said, "and why humans are so stubborn and so fragile and yet so hard to break." He said nothing, and watching her circle him slowly. Your people should not exist, and she continued, and you have no claws and no natural armor, and your strength is laughable compared to ours. And yet you survive everything, and you thrive where others fail, and you refuse to accept that you are lesser. That stung, and Jake felt heat rise in his chest. We survive because we adapt, and he said, and we do not need to be the strongest or the fastest, and we just need to be smart enough to win. Her smile widened, and there was something dangerous and hungry in it. Prove it. She lunged. Jake dove under her reach and grabbed a wrench from the tool rack and swung it at the power coupling on the wall, and sparks exploded, and the room plunged into darkness. He heard her growl, and it was a sound that made his instincts scream, and he rolled sideways and felt her hand brush past where his head had been. Emergency lights flickered on, and casting everything in red. They faced each other across the room, and both breathing hard now. She was not smiling anymore. You could have run just now. And she said, and her voice low, and, why did you attack instead? Because running only works for so long. And Jake said, and eventually you have to fight. Something shifted in her expression, and the predatory gleam softened into something else, and something almost like respect. You are not like the other humans here, and she said, and they grovel and they fear us and they accept their place, and but you, and her eyes narrowed, and you look at me like an equal. I am an equal. And Jake said, and even if you do not believe it, she crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, and he tensed, but she did not attack. And she stopped just inches away, and so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. For a moment they stood there, and the air between them electric and charged, with something neither of them wanted to name. Then she reached out, and her fingers brushed his jaw, and the touch was surprisingly gentle. I have decided, and she said softly, and you will not die tonight. Relief flooded through him, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Then what? And he started to ask. She leaned closer, and her golden eyes capturing his and holding them with an intensity that made his breath catch. You have earned something far more dangerous than my anger. Human, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper, and you have earned my interest. His heart was racing again, but for a completely different reason now. And what does that mean? And he managed to ask. She smiled, and it was not the cold predator smile from before, and it was something warmer and more genuine and infinitely more terrifying. It means, and she said, and that I am not done with you, and it means that tonight when you return to your quarters, I will be there. And it means that you have caught the attention of someone who does not let go of what she finds fascinating. She turned to leave, and her movements fluid and graceful. Jake watched her walk away, and his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. At the doorway she paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. Run if you want, and she said, and it will not matter. And I always catch what I hunt, and human. And her eyes gleamed in the red light, and I think you do not want to run anymore. Then she was gone. Jake stood alone in the ruined control room, and his wrench still in his hand and his heart pounding in his ears. He thought about running and about grabbing his things and stealing a shuttle and disappearing into the void. But even as the thought formed, he knew the truth. She was right. He did not want to run, not anymore. Hours later, when his shift finally ended, and when he walked back to his small quarters in the human section of the station, and he found his door unlocked, he pushed it open slowly. She was there, and sitting on his bunk like she belonged there, and her armor removed and replaced with simple dark clothing that somehow made her look even more dangerous. She looked up as he entered, and her golden eyes meeting his. You came, and she said, and there was satisfaction in her voice. I live here. And he pointed out, and closing the door behind him. She stood, and moving toward him with that same predatory grace. You could have requested a transfer, and you could have hidden in the commons area until morning, and you could have run, but you came here because I am tired of running, and Jake said, and the words felt true as he spoke them. Good, and she said, and stopping in front of him, and because I am tired of chasing. What happens now? And he asked. She reached out, and her hand cupping his face and her touch warm against his skin. Now, and she said, and we see if a human and a Velrani can find common ground, and we see if your cleverness extends beyond survival. and we see where this goes, this being. And he asked, and even though he thought he knew the answer, whatever we make it. And she said, and her thumb tracing his cheekbone, and I have never been interested in a human before, and you are the first who looked at.